I'm James Dart, co-founder of Inspire You and Yes, I Will Vote, and welcome to the 10th episode of Remoaner Telling Our Story series podcast. On this week's episode, we have Seb Dance, the former Labour MEP. Seb and I discussed the Labour Party, what went wrong during the People's Vote days, how things might have panned out differently, and where Labour goes next. We also discussed the solidarity and the sadness that was felt in the European Parliament at the time of our Brexiting. And we discussed the future, where our community goes next. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Seb.
Hi, James. Hi.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
Most people will know who you are, I think, in our community. But for those that perhaps don't know who Seb Dance is, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and obviously you became a member of the European Parliament, how that happened, and what your job was there, just very briefly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, who am I? I'm a political obsessive who has the misfortune to be obsessed with politics, and it's not necessarily a good thing. I was a former member of the European Parliament for London, represented London for just over 5.5 years in the European Parliament. I was the deputy leader of Labour's MEPs in the European Parliament for quite a lot of that time. And right towards the end, I was the vice chair of the Environment Committee in the European Parliament, which is the biggest committee in the Parliament in terms of legislation that it does. Very briefly, I was obsessed with politics since far back as I can remember. My first political memory is Thatcher resigning, shows how old I am. Just from there, I was obsessed with politics and the power of politics and its ability to transform the world around us, but also, to do immeasurable harm as well, and fighting against that. And I'm an internationalist by nature. It's partly kind of, obviously what I believe, but it's also informed by my family background, which, is varied, and people have come from different parts of Europe, and, basically were shooting at each other until not so long ago.
Really? Okay.
And the joy of something else, a different vision of how Europe can work towards towards solving its common problems, means that I've always been a Europhile. I just became politically active, volunteered for things, got selected, and then by some fluke of electoral magic, in 2014, I got elected.
I doubt it was a fluke, Seb. Let's be fair. I think you're very popular. So I want to take you back to the day of the referendum. This is where I've kind of tried to start all of these episodes. Yeah. What were you doing on the day?
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I remember it really well. It was sort of almost biblical weather. I mean, we had these kind of really hot sun, bursts, followed by these torrential downpours. And then at times the sun would shine through the storm clouds, and it would all just feel so dramatic. But I was in a battle bus, a Labour battle bus that was kind of touring bits of London, obviously my constituency at the time. And we were just going everywhere and anywhere, really. We had a list, obviously, of places that we were supposed to go to, and knocking on doors and getting people out. It was a really odd campaign, because obviously this is a tactic that we do all the time. We have data on people that we gather over the years, and then we go out on election day and knock them out, so that we know that we get our supporters to the ballot box. And with this, obviously, we were working with data that we'd only really been collecting for the best part of half a year. I'm pleased to say in London it was fairly accurate. Most people that we spoke to were going out to vote Remain, and we were just encouraging them to do so. And it was an odd day. Obviously, I was feeling extremely nervous. I was feeling kind of reassured by the previous night, actually, the eve of the referendum, where I had been leafleting in Soho, and of course, get quite a skewed picture, because honestly, it was actually ridiculous. I was going up to restaurants, we were leafleting, and I would hold a leaflet up, a stay in, stronger in leaflet. And the whole restaurant would applaud, and they'd be cheering. I'm not making this up. It was a kind of scale of support that you just you just sort of was just overwhelmed by. And I was going out into Soho Square and talking to people. They were cheering and saying, yeah, don't worry, you know, we're going to be voting tomorrow, we're voting in, you know. And obviously I was talking to my colleagues in the rest of the country who were giving me a very different picture. But I just felt, oh my God, the scale of feeling about this was just so strong, really strong. And, you know, the day itself, I remember the reports, which we now know were all tactics, and very successful ones, coming from Vote Leave, saying that, you know, turnout was up in cities, therefore everyone needs to get out. Very effective, but, you know, we sort of believed it as we were traveling around, thinking, you know, this is gonna go our way.
Yeah.
And then, of course, just before 10 o'clock, I remember I spoke to someone at a polling station. He wouldn't tell me how he was going to vote, and he went in, and I knew instantly he was voting Leave. But I thought, well, you know, I've had a good day, so it's a one-off, you know, whatever. And then on the way home, we heard Farage's concession, basically, which again we now know was a tactic to drive the pound down. And yeah, it all went well until Newcastle, and that's immediately when Newcastle came. I can't remember what it was. It was 50 point something Remain.
Yeah,
and I knew then it was over. And the rest of that evening was appalling. I mean, it was one of the worst evenings of my life, and I was crushed, utterly crushed by it.
Yeah, excuse me. For me, it was a little bit different. I hadn't quite got to the stage where I was, you know, passionate about politics. But actually, that evening, I think, or the day after, my response to something that I didn't really know I was passionate about, something I thought I was fairly apathetic about, which was the European Union. My response in the morning told me that something wasn't right, and I needed to, and I wanted to lend my voice to this discussion, even after the fact. So I mean, it was a bit late in the day for me, but and there were so many people like me as well, I think, that saw that, and that was a catalyst for them getting into politics, because they were like, oh, actually, that seems totally nuts what's just happened there. But some of the people I've interviewed on this podcast have had the same feeling of just doom, worst day of their life sort of thing. Some people crying. So it's a strange one, because before David Cameron started talking about the referendum, the EU was never really in the news. It was, if you look at the polling to show what we cared about in the social attitude survey and stuff, the EU was nowhere near. And yet so many people were so affected by the result. It was kind of bizarre. Maybe something that, you know, something we had, and we only realized how good it was until perhaps it looked like it was going to go away. Maybe, I don't know, but So
yeah, I mean, that's the genius of Farage and the Leave campaign, is that they chose an issue that was so far down on people's list of priorities. I think it was something like 16th or something on a survey that was done ahead of the 2015 general election. You know, it was an obsession that they'd had, and that Bill Cash and, you know, and others in the right of the Tory party had for years, but most people didn't, you know, give a toss.
No, of course not. No.
And then all of a sudden, you know, it rises and rises and rises until they make it a binary issue. Are you in or are you out? And of course, that's what the referendum did. It was why the referendum was a monumentally foolish decision, because, you know, you reduce something complex into a yes or no question, and then everybody chooses their camp, and then that's it. You know, you've created this division out of an issue which so few people, you know, rated as an issue beforehand. I mean, it's you know, it's genius, I suppose, in a horrible way, because it worked, obviously. But this was not, you know, the idea that people were chomping at the bit to leave the EU for 40 years is, of course, complete nonsense.
Yeah, quite right. And I remember talking to my mum and dad, who voted to leave. After the vote, they were very passionately defensive about their vote, and it took me and my brother, both of us who started Inspire You Up, it took us well over sort of 18 months really to make any kind of headway with them, in terms of, and I don't say that in a kind of arrogant way, like, oh, we were right and they were wrong and they just needed to sort of understand that. But they said, they came to us eventually and was like, do you know what, we've just not been listening, and there's nothing, all the reasons we voted for Leave, now that we think about it and reflect on it, because you've spoken to us so much about it, we sort of understand now that we were just, it was based on nothing. It was just based on feeling. It wasn't based on any kind of rational decision making. But I think, and this is kind of why Jack and I set Inspire You, was the hope that young people might be able to have those conversations with their parents, and then get some movement, because it just felt like there was so little movement. But anyway, we'll come to that, I think, in a minute. But I wanted to talk to you next about the Labour Party. Obviously, you remember the Labour Party. Do you remember what age you joined the Labour Party? Have you?
I was 16 or 17.
Okay, yeah.
And what year it was.
That's the only party you belonged to. That was the first party you joined.
Yeah. In fact, I've always voted Labour. I voted Labour in my mock school election back in '97. That's that was I've always voted Labour.
So that's hardcore to go. Even at school, you were Labour,
yeah.
But I mean, Labour's role in this period, I think, has been really interesting, because you had a party that was, in terms of membership, very pro-EU, but a leadership that almost was the opposite. And I don't want to draw you too much on the past and get into all of the Corbyn stuff too much, but I wanted to ask you about the triggering of Article 50, because I remember at the time, obviously it wasn't Labour who were in power, so it wasn't them who had the decision, but they voted for it, didn't they? And I remember speaking to a professor at the university where I was studying at the time in Exeter. He wrote an article or an essay about how we should have, before we decided to trigger Article 50, we should have had a sort of a grace period, a kind of cooling off period where we reflected on it and had a kind of national conversation at that stage before triggering Article 50 as to what the destination was, because we decided in the referendum on the kind of direction, which was maybe to leave. Certainly we wanted change, and for very understandable reasons, but we didn't have a roadmap. There was no talk of a destination. There was no, we didn't know if we were going to be leaving the single market or the customs union or any. We just didn't know at that stage. Do you think Labour's decision to vote with the Tories to trigger Article 50 was a mistake?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So I agree with you. I mean, the narrowness of the vote, but also the profound nature of the change and what it would mean for our place in the world and our economy and our society, but also its impact on the union. I mean, the fact that Scotland voted to remain, the fact that Northern Ireland voted to remain, the fact that big cities voted to remain, I mean, should have triggered some kind of red flag, in the sense that, well, okay, you can't dispute the referendum. So I think, some people suggested that, it wasn't valid because, I don't know, whatever, the whole ton of reasons why people say it's not valid. The result was valid. Absolutely it was. There was a clear, if very, very slim majority to leave the European Union. The question is, what does that mean and what does that look like? Because it was never explained, or in fact, there were very many contradictory visions that were given. You mentioned the single market, for instance. There were leaders who said that we wouldn't leave the single market, like Dan Hannan, exactly. And others who explicitly said we would. So, I mean, they could always pull on a quote to prove one thing or the other.
That's right, yeah.
So I absolutely, completely agree. There should have been a full, national conversation about what this means. We should have gone through a period of basically outlining the objectives and then determining whether or not it was possible. Now, of course, it would always have been my view that it's impossible to meet the objectives of vote leave by leaving the European Union. Absolutely impossible. You can't, increase investment. You can't increase opportunities for young people, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go over all the arguments.
Yeah.
But the point was, you needed a process of demonstrating that the direction that we want to go in isn't possible by leaving the EU, or if it is, if we insist on leaving the European Union, that you do so in a way that protects certain aspects like membership of the single market, customs union, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I was always of the view that losing the referendum was a huge setback and a massive tragedy, but ultimately it didn't mean abandoning the idea of promoting being in the EU. Like, why would you abandon the idea of the EU as a force for good on the basis of people voting narrowly to say we want to leave it? It's like, okay, take note of that and let's see how and whether it's possible, and continue to argue that it's not, from my point of view, whilst others, of course, would have argued the opposite, and that's fine. But I was very surprised by the reaction, I think, that sort of just, immediately called for the immediate granting of Article 50, and that's it. Off we go. And I just thought that was extraordinary.
Do you think that Corbyn did it because he was concerned about losing the Red Wall, which obviously he did end up losing?
Yeah, it didn't do any good, did it? Yeah, no, I don't think he had any electoral consideration at that point whatsoever. Okay. I mean, the problem is Labour Party is a Remain party full of Remain members and Remain members of Parliament, but with a vocal but significant minority of Leavers, and that vocal and significant minority happened to be leading it at the time, and that, you know, that was a disaster waiting to happen, and it was one of the reasons why I pleaded with many of my colleagues in Brussels not to vote for Corbyn in the leadership election as far back as 2015, because, you know, it was quite obvious to me where this was going to end up if he became leader. But, you know, that happened, and we tried to steer him in a different direction, mixed success. But yeah, that's fundamentally the reason we had a Leave leadership leading a Remain party.
I mean, just touching on what you said about where the reason we didn't have a conversation, even though we could have had, to what extent is Theresa May an issue here? Because I remember thinking at the time she could have chosen to reach out across the aisle and come up with a kind of cross-party consensus on what Brexit ought to be. But I always got the impression that her view was that she had to pander to the hard right, to the ERG basically, and ended up just being bullied by them.
Yeah. So none of these decisions that anybody took, including, as you say, to pursue the hardest of Brexits without any kind of consideration of what it meant for our politics, our union, or indeed, you know, the kind of cohesiveness of our society, let's face it, they only make sense when you consider that this whole thing is because of the rift in the Tory party. Yeah. So this is a civil war in the Conservative Party that's been going on since 1992. It's over now. The civil war is over. Yeah. The Leavers won.
The Leavers won. Yeah.
And you know, but that war has been going on for years and years and years. And May decided that she would put the interests of her party above the interests of the country, and everything else stems from that. Yeah. And basically that's the heart of the issue throughout, is that this has all been done in the name of the Conservative Party and in uniting the Conservative Party. And on that front, it's a huge success. I mean, the Conservative Party is 100% now united behind a nativist policy, and that's, you know, the moderates have been either expelled or they've been subsumed by it.
Yeah, totally. And with that in mind, then I want to move on to the next question I have, which was, why did it take so long? If I remember Caroline Lucas in one of the debates that she said, and she was pleading with Barry Gardner, I think it was, and she was saying, "Come on, Barry, Brexit is, you know, is of the right, for the right, by the right. You know this. Come on. Give us a ratification vote." So with that in mind, I mean, considering, you know, Corbyn's leadership was very left-wing, far more left-wing than previous Labour leaderships, considering most of the country understood that Brexit was for the right, why did it take so long for Corbyn? I mean, I kind of know the obvious kind of answers about not wanting to lose the Red Wall and blah, blah, but why did it take so long for Corbyn for Labour to end up with offering us a ratification vote? Because they did by 2019, they were one of the parties offering us basically a second vote or a ratifying vote. Why did it take so long?
Our position in 2019 was actually really good. But you're absolutely right. It was too little, too late. And by the point that we arrived at that decision, the damage had basically already been done. I mean, the popular narrative in some quarters now is that, you know, it was a mistake to offer a people's vote, and that we should have, you know, just accepted the referendum. I mean, forgetting the fact that, of course, we would have lost a huge swathe of support from the cities and elsewhere where our position actually was essential in shoring up our vote. But, you know, we came within 9 parliamentary votes of securing a people's vote. That's what people forget. And had that people's vote amendment gone through, and had we secured a people's vote, it would be the Tory party now that would be lying in ruins. It would be the Tory party that would be riven aside. So politics really can turn on a dime. It really can. Yeah. And events completely unexpected. I mean, look at COVID, for example. I mean, they come out of the blue, and they completely change our politics in ways that we can't even imagine. So So it's very kind of fashionable to look back and say that, people like me got it wrong. I don't think we did at all. But yes, it did take a ridiculously long time. And I think that, you touched on one issue. The red wall is a problem because, lots of Labour MPs represented Leave seats. So for them, it was a huge issue. And, those of us who were pleading with them, people like Anna Turley, for example, in Redcar, we were citing her as an example to follow because she represented a Leave seat, but she was adamant that Brexit would do it, untold damage to her constituency. She wasn't holding back. She wasn't pretending. She was basically saying to people, it's not that I'm not listening. Of course I'm listening. I completely understand what you're telling me. But can you please also listen to me when I say this is not the answer? That the worldview of build cash is not going to improve the people's lives in Redcar. Unfortunately, she was, a minority compared to other MPs representing Leave seats, like Caroline Flint, for example, who said that, the only way to save these seats for Labour is to go full on support for Brexit and not to challenge anything that the government's doing on it. Of course, in the end, they both lost their seats, but I'd rather be the person who did it with a bit of integrity, quite frankly, and but stuck to their beliefs in terms of what is right and what is wrong for their communities. But that was a huge challenge at the time, trying to win over very skeptical colleagues who thought that we had to back Leave in order to stop a complete hemorrhage.
And I mean, I have some sympathy, obviously, with certain Labour MPs, like you say, who were in Leave seats and have their careers to think about as well. And I have some level of sympathy. And I remember I put a lot of pressure on what's Plymouth's Labour MP called? I've forgotten him. Luke Pollard.
Luke Pollard.
Yeah. I remember sort of like putting some pressure on him on social media a bit because he was in my neck of the woods. And I knew him to be a Remain advocate privately, but he just wasn't doing it publicly. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to go, too hard on him, but I just know that he probably just needs a bit of a push. And he did get there in the end. But I understood the reason why he was hesitant, because he's now in the shadow cabinet. Had he gone too hard too fast, maybe he would have lost his seat, and now he blah blah blah. But so I sort of understand it to an extent, but ultimately, like you said, both of those people that you said lost their seats, so it was a rock and a hard place for a lot of MPs. But I want to just quickly ask you, was it possible to avoid a general election, hold our nerves in that period? Because I felt like we were so close to people's, it was so close. And I asked AC Grayling this question, and he basically said it wasn't campaigners, it wasn't the public that failed us, really. It was losing our nerve at the wrong moment, because Johnson didn't have the arithmetic in Parliament to do what he wanted to do. And like you said, we were 9 votes away from getting this vote or whatever it was. So could we have avoided a general election? Yes. Could we have got there?
Yes, we could have. Absolutely, we could have. Here's one of the tragedies of history. I mean, history is written by the victors, not the losers. Yeah. So, the narrative is that Brexit is overwhelmingly popular in the country, and that's been proven by the general election result and every vote that we've had. Of course, the alternative, which as we know, we came 9 votes of coming within, was an alternative timeline where both the Liberal Democrat leadership didn't believe the hubris of their own very flawed internal polling, which showed them winning, seat after seat and taking them off the Tories in the South, and Labour's, quite frankly, useless then leadership. Who basically thought that it was just going to be a repeat of 2017, forgetting, of course, that they were up against a very different personality in Johnson, someone who can, quite frankly, reach out and connect to people that May couldn't. A general election was always going to be a catastrophe with a Labour leader like that facing a Tory leader like Johnson, whereas the people's vote was a very different proposition, as of course we indeed saw in the general election result itself, which had a clear majority for parties in numerical terms, not in seat terms, a clear majority for parties backing another referendum. And it is absolutely my conviction that referendum would have completely destroyed the Conservative Party once and for all, because there was no way they could have come back from re-exposing the divisions that the original referendum had sought to bury. So it was a catastrophically stupid decision by the Liberal Democrats and by the then Labour leadership. I have to throw in the SNP here, who basically were acting out of self-interest, in saying, basically, they knew they were going to win big in terms of Westminster seats, so it didn't really affect them from that perspective. But actually, having another Tory government and losing the opportunity of the people's vote, that would be a surefire way to have another independence referendum. So here we are.
Yeah. To be honest, I mean, I've never trusted the SNP on any of the Brexit stuff. I do feel like you just said that they're quite self-interested, but rightly so. If I was in their camp, then I would likely be quite opportunistic in the same way that they've been.
Yeah, that's their raison d'etre, and you can't argue against that. Really, that's what they exist to do. But the decisions taken by those three parties were instrumental in killing off the reasonable chance we had of stopping Brexit.
Could Labour have joined the Progressive Alliance and gone for a tactical vote situation?
I understand. Yeah, I mean, the problem is you have to have a majority government. You have to have an agreement to basically back the Labour Party in order to enact electoral reform. There's no other way of getting electoral reform other than to get rid of the Tory government, and there's no other way under our system to get rid of the Tory government other than to elect a Labour government. And of course, the issue was that nobody, trusted Corbyn really. To be able to deliver that. I think there was some, hope maybe back in the 90s that the Labour Party might back electoral reform, but it won so big that there was no incentive to.
Yeah.
So there's a lesson maybe for some of us, but including me, by the way, who used to be very much against PR, but since becoming a member of the European Parliament, I've swung very much the other way. But yes, I think we have a long way to go. I mean, one thing that's very clear from these local elections we've just had, and indeed the general election of 2019, is that the Tories coalition is really secure. They have managed to get not only their traditional right-wing vote, but they've also got the socially conservative vote that used to vote Labour. Yeah. And they've kept on, this is the crucial thing, they've kept hold of their liberal centrist vote, which is something that we all assumed would either be lost to a party like the Lib Dems, or indeed that a Labour Party under a new leadership might actually be able to get. And the fact that they've got those three things is really interesting and concerning in terms of challenging it. But what we need to do on the other side is we have to build an alliance that can not only shore up the left and the centre left, but to also get that centrist socially liberal vote off Johnson, because we have to chip apart his coalition. That's the only way we can do it.
Yeah, totally agree. I wanted to ask you about Europe. So I've got one more question on Labour. So Europe was an issue which threatened to destroy the Conservative Party. Now, in a weird twist of a weird sort of evil twist, it now threatens to completely destroy the Labour Party because, literally, like we've just said, the coalition on the right is secure, and Labour, not only is the coalition on the left totally inadequate, but Labour itself now seems to be falling apart under the weight of Brexit, because Remainers are putting pressure on Starmer to be more pro-EU, and other people in Labour are saying, well, no, Brexit's done, we just need to pretend that it doesn't exist, and blah, blah, blah. So how can you reconcile the Remain-Leave divide in the Labour Party, do you think?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, and it falls back to this question of competing coalitions and how do you unify, a vote in traditional Labour constituencies that is very not only comfortable with Brexit, but actually sees its delivery as a huge plus, irrespective of what they actually feel about the issue. The fact that it's been delivered, that conviction. Exactly. It's a very popular view. With this view, from our cities and core, other parts of the core Labour vote, which is very anti-Brexit and extremely concerned about its long-term impacts on our economy, but also the cohesiveness of our society and the opportunities, particularly for young people. How do you reconcile that? I mean, the thing I'd say is, look, the Labour leaders' instincts are correct. He is an internationalist. He believes in the strength of institutions like the EU. He'd rather Brexit hadn't happened. But we are not going to get a position from anyone at the moment that says, let's rejoin the EU. Now, what you can have is a position where we pick apart what is wrong with what the government has done, that we pick apart the flaws in the deal that they have made, and that we gradually move to a position where it becomes unarguable that we have to, in some way, move back into the European sphere. Now, I'm very clear that the logical extension of that in however many years' time is rejoining, but there are several steps that we have to go through before we get to that point. So we, as people who want to rejoin the European Union, have to get our head around the fact that that is going to be a staged process.
Yeah.
But the key thing here now is to win that fight amongst progressives. And the Labour Party in particular, which is, it's unsustainable to have a situation where our exporters are unable to compete, where Britain is put at a constant competitive disadvantage. Putting aside the constitutional questions about the future of the Union, what possible sustainable route is there for a country where it costs more to do business, where people who have a choice over where they invest will look at Britain and think, well, hang on a minute, I need to do X, Y, Z that I don't need to do in any other European country. I can't get the people I want there, et cetera, et cetera. That, I think, is a way of chipping away at the Tories' supposed bastion of strength, which is business and the economy, and putting the country on the best competitive footing. That used to be a core Tory strength. Why aren't we attacking them for that? That's where we should be undermining them, in my view. And I think people will sort of be frustrated that no one is saying rejoin, and there may well be elements of other parties that kind of hint at it a bit more strongly, but ultimately you have to have a Labour government to unseat the Tories under our system. There's no other way. So the only way through this is to invest heavily in the Labour Party. There's no other route back to rejoining.
I mean, I've come around to that opinion myself, actually, as someone that was a Lib Dem, still technically in the Lib Dem party, but I spend far more of my time these days urging people to go the way of Labour, which would probably get me thrown out if anyone in the Lib Dems heard or cared.
Just as well, this isn't being broadcast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but anyway, no, I mean, you're right. The Lib Dems are nowhere, the Greens are nowhere. The only way to get anything that anybody wants in the progressive sphere right now is to get a Labour government into power, either in a majority or minority. It doesn't really bother me too much, but we just got to get you guys in there as quickly as possible.
And I know there'll be people hearing this going, oh, I'm sick of this. Why should I have to compromise on this? And I get that, and it sucks. And there's no reason why supporting the Greens is any less valid than or Lib Dems or anyone else is any less valid than anything. Of course it's not. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I am saying is that under our system, under our majoritarian system, first past the post, you have to accept that the only way to get rid of the Tories is to elect a Labour government, and everything else will follow from there, really. And I honestly feel that there are different circumstances locally about kind of what's going on in councils and so on that might differ. But when it comes to Westminster Parliament, MPs electing members of Parliament under a first past the post system, I'm afraid, if you're not a Labour supporter but you want a route out of this mess, and you have to vote with a nose peg on you.
So long as you're in a constituency where Labour have a chance of actually winning.
Absolutely.
So I move on to
say vote Labour, whatever, but yes, you're absolutely
right. You have to say vote for Labour. I'm allowed to say vote tactically because I'm not technically standing for anything or anything. So, but we need a Labour government, and the way to get a Labour government is to make sure that we're unseating as many Tories as possible. And winning as many seats for Labour in the places where Labour can win. But so moving on to Europe, what's so good about Europe? Why did you become a member of European Parliament? Obviously, you said you've got family from across Europe and stuff, so I guess you've got a personal connection to the continent and arguably the institution as well. But what's so good about the European Union? Why should anyone care about it?
I mean, the European Union is unique, right? So we've got countries and we've got intergovernmental institutions like the UN, and all sorts of different models of how we solve international problems, and that's great. But the EU is unique in that it occupies this space that's in between being a country and in between being an intergovernmental set of institutions and a talking shop, right? So it kind of has this different vision, really, of what a political entity can do and feel and sound like. And what I love about it is the fact that you have people from different traditions and political experiences coming together and effectively, deciding collectively on common problems to common solutions. I mean, there are people, my former colleagues, as a friend of mine now, who's now the Prime Minister of Estonia. I mean, she grew up in the Soviet Union. I mean, there are the political circumstances that people come from and the histories that they bring is just so illuminating. And I think when you talk to people from different cultures and traditions, you come to understand just a little bit more about the world. And I don't think it should stop at Europe, by the way. I think this is a model that many other parts of the world could and should be following. I think you look at other trade organizations like ASEAN, for example, that are, this kind of getting there. But, look at the EU and the level of democratic oversight that exists through the parliament, through the supervision of national parliaments of legislation that goes through and so on. The fact that, treaty change is not something dull and boring, but something that people are being invited to contribute to, that citizens are actively encouraged to take part in. And I think it's very exciting, and it's devoid of this, it's not embarrassing, to sort of, it's not an adversarial kind of pride, is what, you can feel pride in being European and having a sense of collective identity without this sort of, a kind of rather difficult side of nationalism, which sometimes crosses over from pride into bravado, into outright hostility. And I think this provides an alternative model that works, quite frankly.
Yeah.
By and large.
Yeah, well, I mean, my next question was, what are the major flaws of the EU that you saw as a member of the European Parliament? Because obviously there are very few people on our side of the argument that argue that it's perfect. And there are lots of people that say it needs reform. But what did you discover when you got there in terms of where those reforms might be best placed?
Yeah, I mean, so one of its strengths is, as I say, the fact that, it can be slightly, that the passions that drive it can be slightly less hostile. But that's also a weakness in the sense that it can sometimes be a little bit dry and a little bit impersonal. And behave much more as if it's a sort of managerial process rather than something that engenders passion and that's really the nature of how it developed. I mean, it was the coal and steel community. I mean, you don't get out of bed for that, do you?
No.
I think, coal and steel collectivization, that's what it's all about. But of course, that was a huge, crucial part of limiting countries' ability to declare war on each other. It's obviously just been extended and built on over time. And I think, building that passionate relationship with the idea of Europe is something that it needs to get much better at. And I have to say, I'm in danger of sounding a bit like an old-fashioned federalist here, but the member states do get in the way quite a bit. I'm thinking in particular about the areas and files that I used to work on, environment and climate change and air quality. And often you would find national capitals, the mayors, the city regions, pushing for change and really ambitious targets, particularly on emissions. And the member states would be pushing back, saying, "Oh, it's far too costly, or we can't possibly do this." And I would find this time and time again that if the cities could get together, if Berlin and Bratislava and Bilbao could get together and determine what is in their common interests and look at best practice and decide to implement it, the EU would be so much better. Because in my mind, there is no disconnect between multilateralism and internationalism and localism. I think the two can coexist perfectly well, where you have a pride and a sense of identity with your locality, but at the same time you recognize how working with other localities you can create common solutions that work for everyone. And I honestly think that mix is where the EU should head. And I think the intergovernmental aspects are its biggest kind of stumbling block and barrier to change.
Okay, interesting. I won't go too much more into that because I think there's so much that I would ordinarily want to talk to you about on that, but we'd run out of time otherwise. I just wanted to quickly ask you about your colleagues in the European Parliament whilst you were there. I've interviewed other members of the European Parliament from the UK in the past, and they've all more or less said that their European colleagues were very supportive, gutted that we were leaving. Was this your experience? Did you get a lot of support? Was there a lot of emphasis on trying to keep us in the European Parliament? And also, what was the sentiment by the time you left? Had it shifted at all?
No, I think by the time we left, it had got even stronger, and there was a lot more emotion at the time that we left than I think in the immediate aftermath of the vote. Okay. I mean, the immediate aftermath of the vote was a bit awkward, actually, because we felt almost as if we'd let our colleagues down a little bit by not winning the referendum. I mean, silly emotion, but I think a lot of us felt that, and we were worried that I think people thought that we didn't get the European Union, what it's about, and that we somehow deserved to leave. And certainly in one or two meetings, I had a few people say, well, why would we listen to your opinion because you're leaving? And that was an extremely difficult period because, of course, you had to say, well, not only did I fight tooth and nail not to leave, but I consider myself intrinsically a part of this family, and of course, added to that, I represent an area that didn't vote to leave either. So you can't kind of exclude us from the conversation. And I think over time, it became far more apparent that this was a battle that was not settled. So when I first spoke to members of the Commission and their cabinet about the possibility of Brexit not happening, they sort of thought I was a little bit fantastical. And like, oh look, Seb, you haven't quite come to terms with it. And then as obviously we got on through the process and the nonsense of it, it's easy to forget everything that happened now, but it was really touch and go, and people started to realize, hang on a minute, there's a chance the Brits could actually stay. And it was really right up until December the 12th, the general election of 2019. It was really right up until then that I think there was still a sense of possibility. And then when it finally happened, it wasn't relief, I don't think, that which you might expect, but actually a lot of sadness, a lot of genuine sadness. That really this was something that was unnecessary and isn't going to help anyone, and really could have been avoided, but ultimately we are where we are. So yeah, a lot of regrets, a lot of tears.
Despite us having a reputation for being a bit tricky, we were kind of the awkward partner at times.
Yeah, we were, but I mean, and I say this, are we any worse than Orban or the PIS in Poland?
No,
I mean,
I don't think so.
Yeah, we were an awkward partner sometimes, but I think also what happened in the aftermath of the referendum was a huge display of Remain and disaffection with Brexit. I mean, up to 1 million people on the streets. It made a massive difference. Don't ever underestimate the impact that had on my former colleagues, because
that's good to know.
They've never seen that in their own member states. They've never seen millions of people marching down the street waving EU flags. And here it was in this country that had just voted to leave. So it made a profound impact on a lot of people, and actually could be quite instrumental, by the way, if Scotland were ever to vote to leave the UK. I think that display of emotion is something that people won't forget very easily.
So Scotland would be able to find it very easy to get into the EU if they apply.
I think politically, yes. Economically, much harder, running a structural deficit. And I'm not going to have an argument about whether or not Scotland should leave the UK, but clearly the political will would be there to have any part of the UK, frankly, back in, if not the whole UK, preferably. But yes, that political will is most definitely there everywhere. Good. By the way, that's the Commission, the Parliament. That sentiment is near universal.
Good. So where are we now, Seb, as a community? I know we've sort of touched on it a minute ago. We said about Labour and how they might reconcile the vote, but as a broader Remain community cross-party, where are we now? Because I know you've also said that it's going to take incremental steps. It's going to be a sort of maybe join the odd thing, get a bit closer over time. Are we looking at a decade? Are we looking at a couple of decades? What time frame? Well, hang on. Sorry, hang on. Can I just? I'll rephrase that. Firstly, presumably, because you said at the beginning of this, you think we should rejoin.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Here's my face mask. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, good man. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think so, but for two reasons. Firstly, it's the right thing to do for the country, for young people, for our economy, for our exporters, for our tourism, for our place in the world, so on and so forth. The second reason, I think it's unsustainable where we are at the moment. You cannot have a situation where you leave your biggest market, you slap extra costs on businesses, and kind of expect everyone to just sort of be okay with it. Now, of course, the rebound from COVID, there's going to be a huge economic boom, because when you stretch a piece of elastic so far, it will snap back. We've had a huge retraction in our economy. Of course, it's going to snap back. But over time, those additional costs from Brexit will become unignorable. You can ignore them now because they're sort of covered by the pandemic, and people aren't traveling, so you're not really seeing the effects really at an aggregate level. You are at an individual level, and for some companies it's existential, but at an aggregate level, people don't sense it yet. But over time, that divergence will have an impact. So you asked me on timeframes. The honest answer is I have no idea, but I will say this to everyone in our community is try and breathe a little. So take a step back and recognize that we are in the nadir at the moment. So, maintain your anger. Absolutely. That's the right emotion to have and store as a source of energy.
Good.
Don't ever let go of your anger. But don't despair either. Recognize that, yes, this is a nadir, but the thing about being at the bottom is you're at the bottom, right? The only way is up, to quote Yaz. So there is literally only one direction that we can go now, and that is back towards the European sphere. It's not possible for an unsustainable situation to last very long at all. So have faith. Bit by bit, we will chip away at this. But it will take time. It absolutely will take time. And if people are thinking in timeframes of the next general election, I think probably need to adjust their horizons. Yeah. This is something that will, almost certainly not be a feature in the next general election. But the one after, I reckon it could. So, let's resolve to not despair and keep chipping away at this.
Well said. I mean, I wonder if you had any sort of practical steps for people in terms of their campaigning energy, because obviously there are other things that people in our community care about. For instance, for me, climate change, electoral reform are the two big ones. And I do tend to put time and thought into those areas as well. So what should our community be doing in terms of practical campaigning steps? Where ought they to be putting their energy?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. Don't ever stop campaigning on the issues that drive you. Most definitely, even when they seem like lost causes. I mean, yeah. I mean, you mentioned climate change. That's the single most important issue facing us as a species and us as a planet. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. The reason Brexit, of course, comes into this is because you have to ask, well, where will the decisions that matter on climate change take place? Will they take place in Westminster, or will they take place in Brussels? And the answer, of course, is Brussels is going to be much more influential in the future. So look for ways in which your community can feed into the discussion that's happening elsewhere, and put pressure on the opposition, for example, to make sure that we have some kind of voice when it comes to the decisions that are made in Brussels. Like, what is happening at a local level? What is your city doing? What is your region doing to combat climate change? And how can they work collaboratively with partners in Europe to try and get those issues better known and more discussed? It's almost as if we sort of have to circumvent the government, really, and pretend they don't exist and do it ourselves. And quite frankly, I think there'll be a lot of my former colleagues who would love to hear from people in the UK about what's happening, and take part in forums and join groups that share information and networks, and let's just try and recreate the EU without being in it.
Yeah, okay.
Forget the government, forget Brexit, and just get on and talk to our friends and neighbours about how we solve the problems we face.
Yeah, brilliant. I know you have to leave, so perhaps we'll leave it there. Seb Dance, thank you very much.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Next week on the show, we have Professor Michael Duggan, a well-known figure in our community, a powerful, forceful, intelligent voice on Brexit over the course of the last few years. In this episode, we discuss the challenges that faced the People's Vote campaign early on, and what we can learn from that. We discuss the situation for Northern Ireland now, and the impact that Brexit has had, especially down the Irish Sea. And we discuss more broadly whether or not we've seen any benefits at all to Brexit since it's happened. Spoiler, we haven't. Hope to see you then. Thanks so much.